He had forbidden even his own children from ever stepping inside the barn. The family thought he was a stubborn, greedy old man, but after his death, his grandchildren finally decided to open the doors, and what they discovered inside changed everything they thought they knew about him and left everyone stunned. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun always rose early over the Harper farm, spilling gold across the wide fields and awakening the morning dew that clung stubbornly to every blade of grass. For more than half a century, James Harper had risen before that same sun, his body conditioned to the rhythm of the land. Even as age carved deep lines into his face and bent his broad shoulders with invisible weights, James remained as constant as the seasons that circled him year after year. He was a man molded by toil and persistence, a figure of quiet dignity whose presence commanded both respect and a kind of reverent distance. His skin, dark as rich soil, bore the marks of years beneath merciless southern skies, and his hands were ridged and rough, carrying the history of 1,000 small labors. James's story had not begun in abundance. His father had been a farmhand, never allowed to own the soil he worked, moving from field to field at the will of white landowners who saw him as nothing more than cheap labor. His mother scrubbed laundry for families in town, her back bent beneath baskets of clothes that were never hers. For them, ownership was a dream so distant it almost seemed like fantasy. But for James, growing up in the shadow of their exhaustion and yet hearing the whispered prayers at night that one day their children might stand on land of their own, the dream became an obsession. He worked wherever he could as a boy, taking odd jobs, saving every cent, and when the time came he bought a small, battered piece of ground that others had dismissed as useless. It was rocky, overgrown, and choked by weeds, but to James it was paradise. He poured his youth into it, turning barren acres into fertile soil with nothing but sweat, determination, and a quiet refusal to surrender. The farm grew with him. What began as a few acres and a shack expanded into fields of corn that stretched into the horizon, rows of cotton that shimmered white under the southern sun, and groves of fruit trees that yielded more every season. Chickens scattered across the yard, cows grazed lazily in the pasture, and every spring calves stumbled on new legs under James's watchful eyes. His home, though modest, carried an air of strength. The walls were thick, the wood smelled of pine, and the porch was worn smooth by countless evenings where James sat, listening to the wind hum through the trees and watching the sky fade from blue to indigo. But on the edge of his property, away from the laughter of his grandchildren and the busy rhythm of farm life, stood the barn. Weathered, grayed by storms and time, it loomed like a sentinel over the fields. Its large double doors remained locked, a heavy rusted padlock dangling from chains that creaked when the wind caught them. People who visited often asked why it stood untouched. James always deflected their curiosity with a short shake of his head. Neighbors whispered their theories, children dared each other to peek through its cracks, but no one ever stepped inside. For James, the barn was more than a building. It was a place of memory, burden, and protection. He never spoke of it, not even to his closest kin. His children had grown up in that house, raised under the weight of their father's expectations and the legacy of the land. They had learned to plant seeds in straight rows, to coax life out of stubborn ground, and to mend fences under blistering heat. James was not an unkind father, but he was stern, and his lessons carried the sharp edge of survival. He reminded them constantly that the soil beneath their feet was not simply dirt, it was history, freedom, and responsibility. Yet, as they grew, Each child looked at the endless fields with restless eyes. Where James saw security, they saw confinement. Where he saw legacy, they saw chains. Daniel, the eldest, had been the most rebellious. From the time he was a teenager, he devoured magazines about technology and dreamed of running companies in the city. He believed innovation, not tradition, would carve the future, and the plow seemed to him a relic of a dying world. Matthew, the middle child, had inherited their late mother's flair for creativity. He spent more time in the kitchen than in the fields, concocting meals out of whatever ingredients the farm produced, and secretly nurtured the dream of opening a restaurant where his food could be tasted and admired. Sarah, the youngest, had an eye for patterns and fabrics. She collected old dresses, tore them apart, and stitched them anew, imagining a boutique of her own filled with designs inspired by countryside life, but meant for the bustle of city streets. James saw all these ambitions with a mix of pride and dread. He admired their talents, but he feared the cost of chasing dreams too far from the land. The world outside the farm was unstable, cruel, and fleeting. Money could vanish, businesses could collapse, and ambitions could burn out. But land, he insisted, would always endure. When drought came, the earth still promised recovery with patience. When storms passed, the soil remained. His children, however, were deaf to these words. They did not want patience, they wanted opportunity, and to them their father's stubbornness looked like selfishness. The tension that simmered between them often settled over the dinner table. The clinking of forks would pause, the cicadas buzzing outside seeming louder as Daniel or Matthew or Sarah would mention plans that required money their father would not release. And, inevitably, the barn would be dragged into the conversation. It was large, it was valuable, and to the children it was the most visible proof of their father's refusal to help them. They pressed him, asking why he guarded it so fiercely when it seemed nothing more than wasted wood. James's response was always sharp, sometimes even harsh, and the subject would end in silence, but never in resolution. Despite the growing distance from his children, James's devotion to the land never faltered. He woke before dawn, the rooster's crow echoing across the valley, and worked until the sky turned purple with twilight. The soil answered his devotion with steady harvests. He tended the animals with hands that had grown slower, but no less careful. He fixed tractors, sharpened plows, and patched roofs. Every creak of the farmstead, every gust of wind through the barn boards, every furrow in the earth seemed tied to his very heartbeat. And yet, in the quiet moments, when he sat alone on the porch after sunset, or when he walked past the barn with only the moon as his witness, James felt the weight of something heavier than age. The land was his pride, but the fractures in his family gnawed at him like unrelenting pests. He wondered if perhaps he had been too hard, if his insistence on patience and tradition had blinded him to his children's desires. Still, when he looked at the barn and remembered why it had to remain closed, his resolve hardened again. Some truths, he knew, were too important to reveal until the time was right. The seasons cycled with relentless predictability. The crops sprouted, grew tall, bowed under the weight of their fruit, and were harvested. The animals bore young, the trees blossomed and shed their leaves, and James kept moving through it all, a steadfast figure at the center of the farm. Neighbors respected him, even if they did not understand him. His grandchildren adored him, though their parents often did not. And, above everything else, the barn loomed quietly in the distance, a reminder that within James Harper's legacy there lay a mystery, sealed away behind heavy wood and rusting iron, waiting for the day when the family would be forced to confront what it meant. That day had not yet come, but James knew it was approaching. He felt it in the heaviness of his limbs, in the way the morning sun sometimes blinded him longer than before, in the ache that lingered in his bones after a long day's work. He was a man nearing the twilight of his years, and he had one final lesson to leave behind. The barn was not a burden, nor was it a wasted structure. It was a promise, a test, and an inheritance far greater than his children yet understood, and as long as he drew breath, its doors would remain closed. The farm continued to breathe with him, each sunrise marking another day of devotion. James Harper, farmer, father, and guardian of secrets, stood watch over his land, holding the weight of his ancestors in his heart, and preparing, silently, for the moment when his descendants would have to decide whether they truly understood what it meant to own something worth more than gold. The years on the Harper farm moved with the rhythm of the earth, steady and unhurried, but inside the Harper household the rhythm was beginning to fracture. James's children, no longer young, carried within themselves restless visions that had little to do with soil, seed, and harvest. Their father's teachings had ingrained discipline and skill into their hands, yet their hearts leaned toward futures that seemed unreachable within the boundaries of the farm. The tension that had first been silent began to take form in quiet conversations, sighs at the dinner table, and the distant looks in their eyes as they gazed past the fields that had raised them. Daniel, the eldest, bore his ambitions like a badge of honor. He had always been quick with numbers, his mind calculating and hungry for systems and progress. While his father saw a broken tractor and thought of hours of repair with his own hands, Daniel imagined an entirely new machine, sleek and efficient, built with technology that farmers of the next generation would embrace. He dreamed of designing agricultural management systems, networks of sensors and devices that would control the land with precision. He read magazines that arrived from the city, filled with articles about the coming digital age, and tucked them under his mattress so his father would not see. To Daniel, the farm felt like a cage for his brilliance. He wanted skyscrapers, meetings, and contracts, things that could prove he had stepped beyond the limitations of his upbringing. Matthew, the middle child, lived more through his senses than his thoughts. He inherited the creative soul of his late mother, who had once filled their home with song and small sketches pinned to the walls. But Matthew's gift was not music or drawing, it was food. From a young age he lingered near the stove, watching the bubbling pots, tasting spices, and learning how to craft flavors out of the simplest ingredients. He was happiest not in the fields, but in the kitchen, experimenting with the farm's produce, trying to turn them into something beautiful. He dreamed of opening a restaurant in the city, a place with warm lights and crowds of people praising the dishes he created. For him, farming was only the first step, a source of ingredients, but never the life he wanted to dedicate himself to. He yearned for attention, for recognition, for a life where his art was celebrated beyond the boundaries of family meals. Sarah, the youngest, was the quiet visionary. She loved the farm in a different way than her brothers. She saw beauty in patterns, the curve of cornrows stretching into the horizon, the delicate lace of frost on the barn windows in winter, the way fabrics hung when she stitched them into new forms. She collected scraps of cloth, repurposed old clothing, and taught herself to sew by candlelight. Her dream was to open a boutique, to design clothes that carried a hint of the countryside spirit but were meant for people in the bustling city who longed for something rustic and unique. For Sarah, the farm inspired her creativity, but she could not imagine spending her whole life bound to it. She wanted a window display in a busy street, customers admiring her creations, and her name stitched into labels that traveled farther than her father's crops ever could. All three carried their visions with them, and each one quietly felt their father stood in the way. The land was valuable. They knew it. They had heard neighbors speak of prices, had read articles about the growing demand for farmland. A portion of it, they reasoned, could fund their futures without destroying the legacy James held so tightly. But James never wavered. Every time the subject was brought up, his answer was final. The land was not to be sold. He had given his life to it, and it had given life back to them. To his children, however, his refusal felt like a deliberate punishment, as if he would rather see them tied to plows forever than free to pursue their passions. The barn stood at the center of their resentment. From their perspective, it was a structure wasting away with time, unused and locked against their curiosity. Its sheer size suggested value. Why guard something so fiercely if it was not important? They asked him again and again to let them see inside, or, better yet, to sell it to someone who could put it to use. James's face would harden every time the barn was mentioned, and his words, though calm, cut like cold steel. He told them it housed dangerous equipment, that it was no place for them, that it was not theirs to worry about. His refusal only fueled their suspicions. To them, it was not dangerous machines he was guarding, but opportunity, an opportunity he was unwilling to share. Dinner tables became battlegrounds. Forks clinked against plates as Daniel argued that even a few acres of land could change their lives. Matthew spoke of the restaurant he could open, describing it so vividly that Sarah could almost taste the meals he conjured. Sarah herself outlined visions of a boutique, of clothes and bright displays and city dwellers carrying her designs into the world. Each dream carried the weight of desperation, and each time their father dismissed it, a layer of bitterness grew thicker between them. James listened, but when he spoke, his voice carried the finality of the land itself. He reminded them of years when the soil had fed them after their mother's passing, when money had been scarce, but food from the fields had kept them alive. He told them that while money could vanish overnight, the land would always endure. His words fell heavy, but to his children they felt like chains instead of wisdom. The first real conflict came one spring morning. The family gathered in the kitchen as James prepared for his rounds. The children had stayed up late the night before, whispering about their futures, weighing their frustrations against their father's iron grip. When they confronted him, their voices carried unusual force. They had researched land values, they told him. Just 20 acres, a small portion, could provide enough capital for each of them to begin their ventures. They painted pictures of what they could build, the lives they could live. For the first time, James did not respond with patience. His face darkened and his voice rose. He shook his head so firmly that the floorboards seemed to tremble. To him, their request was not just about land. It was a betrayal of everything he had sacrificed, everything his father had dreamed, everything his own hands had built. The tension hung in the air long after his words faded. Sarah's eyes drifted toward the barn, its silhouette visible from the kitchen window. Daniel followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. Matthew leaned back in his chair, silent but smoldering. They saw a father who had chosen stubbornness over their happiness, who hoarded resources while they were left to dream without means. And though no words were spoken in that moment, a line had been drawn. From that day forward, the distance grew. The children still worked the farm out of duty, but their spirits were no longer in it. They moved through the chores like prisoners fulfilling sentences, their minds already in the cities where they longed to be. James noticed the shift, and though he tried to ignore it, the weight pressed heavily on him. He loved his children, but he could not allow them to destroy what generations had fought to secure. The barn remained locked, the land untouched by sales, and the silence between father and children deepened until it was nearly unbridgeable. Yet, in that silence, seeds of betrayal were being sown. The children's frustration curdled into determination. They would find a way to break free, even if it meant defying the man who had given them life. And the barn, always looming at the edge of the fields, became not just a mystery but a symbol of the divide, a silent accusation that their father valued secrets more than their futures. What had once been a home filled with laughter and lessons was slowly becoming a house shadowed by resentment. And though none of them yet understood the cost, the path toward rupture had already begun. The days that followed the heated arguments in the Harper household stretched long and uneasy, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The air itself seemed heavier, the silence between father and children no longer born of misunderstanding but of bitterness and growing resolve. James noticed it each morning as he walked the fields alone, his children trailing behind with the motions of work, but none of the devotion. Their eyes no longer studied the soil or the skies as he had taught them. They stared instead at distant points beyond the farm, at imagined futures that seemed brighter than the furrows under their boots. He tried to tell himself it was a phase, that time and maturity might turn them back to the land. Yet, deep in his chest he carried a gnawing unease, the sense that something had already been lost and could not be reclaimed. Daniel, Matthew, and Sarah shared glances at the dinner table, unspoken words flickering between them as their father ate in silence. He had always been a man of few words, but now those silences felt like walls that his children no longer tried to climb. When night fell and James retired to his room, his children stayed awake, their voices low and conspiratorial. They whispered of opportunity, of how unfair it was to have dreams caged by one man's stubbornness. The barn, always at the center of their thoughts, loomed like a specter in their imaginations. They pictured stacks of equipment, or perhaps valuables hidden away, resources that could finance everything they longed to do. If only their father would let go of what he clung to, they thought, life could finally begin. Daniel, with his calculating mind, began to take the lead in their secret conversations. He had overheard neighbors speak of developers seeking farmland for new projects. He had even spoken casually to one in town, feigning interest. The numbers had startled him, prices that exceeded anything he had imagined. Just a fraction of their land could set each of them on their path, and the barn itself, with its sturdy frame and large size, could be a prize in its own right. The temptation grew until it was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. Matthew, though more hesitant, was swayed by the vision of his restaurant. He imagined tables filled with patrons, his food admired and remembered, his name carried on the lips of those who tasted his creations. He told himself that his father simply did not understand his talent, that greatness often required risks and sacrifices. The land was his father's comfort, but to Matthew it was an anchor, holding him back from the recognition he craved. Sarah, the quiet dreamer, found herself torn. She loved the patterns of the fields, the colors of the farm at sunrise and sunset. Yet even she could not deny the pull of her ambitions. In the city, she could design clothes that people wore proudly, garments that bore her mark. She wanted her name stitched into fabric just as firmly as her father's name was tied to the soil. In the end, her longing to create a life beyond the farm outweighed her reluctance. One night, as cicadas hummed in the dark and the house creaked with the familiar sounds of settling wood, the three siblings made their decision. They would no longer wait for their father's approval. They would take what they needed. The plan was whispered between them with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. They knew where their father kept his papers, the metal filing cabinet in his room, always locked but with a key he kept nearby. They had seen him place deeds and documents there over the years, had watched him retrieve them during tax season or when renewing agreements. If they could get their hands on the land deed, they could make arrangements without his knowledge. Daniel knew a man in town who could handle the rest, a developer eager for new opportunities. The night they carried out their plan was heavy with the weight of their betrayal. The moon shone faintly through drifting clouds as the three crept through the house, careful not to wake their father. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet seemed deafening. In the dim light, Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the drawer where the key was kept, her breath shallow. Daniel's jaw was set, determination eclipsing hesitation. Matthew lingered at the door, his stomach twisting, but his desire overpowered his conscience. When the lock clicked open and the metal drawer slid out, the sound seemed to echo through the room like a thunderclap. Inside lay the documents, crisp and orderly, symbols of decades of careful stewardship. To James, they were sacred. To his children, in that moment, they were the keys to freedom. They took the deed, their hands trembling but their eyes alight with resolve. Within days, they had arranged the sale of a remote parcel of land, a section James rarely visited. The developer, unaware of the family strife, was more than willing to move quickly. Money changed hands in amounts that dazzled the siblings. For the first time, their dreams felt within reach. Daniel leased office space in the city, his head filled with plans of innovation. Matthew found a charming building that he envisioned transforming into his restaurant, already planning menus in his mind. Sarah rented a modest but fashionable storefront where she imagined mannequins dressed in her creation standing proudly in the window. They divided the money, their hearts racing with the thrill of possibility, each convinced they had finally broken free of the cage their father had built. When James discovered what they had done, the confrontation was not the explosion his children expected. He did not shout, did not curse, did not strike the table with his fists. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen where they sat, his face unreadable, his eyes carrying a weight that silenced them instantly. His voice, when it came, was quiet, so quiet that it pierced deeper than any roar could have. "Trust," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Once broken, is near impossible to restore." The siblings stumbled over explanations. They told him he had left them no choice, that he had refused to support their happiness, that the land was wasted in his stubborn grasp. They pointed toward the barn, that looming symbol of his secrecy, accusing him of hoarding while they were forced to struggle. Their voices rose, fueled by defensiveness and resentment, but James did not argue. He listened, his face etched with sorrow deeper than anger, and when they finished, he simply turned away. That silence, that quiet rejection, struck harder than any condemnation. From that moment, the fracture was complete. The children stopped visiting except on obligatory holidays, and even then the conversations were stilted, awkward, and brief. They had chosen their paths, and their father, though still living under the same sky, seemed as distant as a stranger. James poured his energy back into the farm, his body slower now, but his will unbroken. He tended the fields, cared for the animals, and walked past the barn with the same firm gaze, as if guarding it not only from outsiders but from the wounds left by his own kin. Yet the farm was not entirely silent. His grandchildren, innocent of the conflicts that had scarred their parents, found their way to the fields each summer. To them, the farm was a place of wonder and learning, and to James, their laughter was a balm for the pain of betrayal. He became alive in their presence, teaching them to plant seeds, to mend fences, to watch the skies and predict the weather. He gave them pieces of himself that his own children had rejected, and, in return, they gave him hope that not all ties had been severed. Even with them, though, one rule remained unchanged. The barn was forbidden, its secrets held close, waiting for a time that only James could determine. The Harper family had been broken by betrayal, the children chasing dreams built on land taken in deceit, the father retreating deeper into silence and sorrow. The rift widened with every passing year, and though each side tried in moments of weakness to justify their choices, the truth remained. Something precious had been lost, something that could never be fully regained. And still, through every season, the barn stood locked, its heavy doors guarding not only the secrets within, but the fragile thread of legacy that James Harper clung to as the storms of family conflict raged around him. The silence that followed the rupture between James and his children was not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, of words unsaid and visits left unmade. The kitchen, that had once been filled with the murmurs of family meals, now echoed mostly with the quiet clatter of dishes and the hum of cicadas through open windows. James moved through the days with his familiar routine, slower now than in his younger years, yet as steadfast as ever. The fields still demanded his labor, and the animals still needed care. Life on the farm did not halt because of broken trust, but it felt heavier, lonelier. Where once his children had worked beside him, there were only empty spaces, reminders of paths they had chosen away from him. And yet, the farm was not entirely devoid of joy. Every summer, when school let out and city life grew too stifling for restless young hearts, his grandchildren came. They arrived in bursts of energy, their laughter ringing across the yard before they even reached the porch. Lily, Emma, and David, though shaped by the modern world of towns and streets, televisions, and bright neon, took to the farm as if the soil itself welcomed them. They ran through the tall grass, chased chickens that clucked in alarm, and watched in awe as calves stumbled on unsteady legs in the spring. To them, the land was not a prison or a burden. It was a place of adventure, of learning, of connection. James cherished those summers more than words could say. With his grandchildren, he could share the lessons that had built his life, lessons that seemed wasted on his own children. He showed them how to press a seed into the ground at just the right depth, how to cover it lightly with soil and water it so that it would not drown. He taught them to mend fences with steady hands, to listen to the way the wind shifted before a storm, to care for an animal not as property but as a living creature deserving respect. Their questions came endlessly, and James, patient in ways he had not been with his own children, answered each one. In their eager faces, he saw hope that the thread of his family's legacy might not yet be broken beyond repair. There were evenings when the sun dipped low, staining the fields in red and gold, and the grandchildren sat cross-legged at his feet, while James told stories of his father and grandfather. He spoke of men who had bent their backs under the weight of other people's fields, who had dreamed of freedom but died before they could claim it. He told them of his mother's prayers whispered by candlelight, prayers that one day her children would stand tall on land that belonged to them and not to a master. These were not tales of romance or adventure, but of endurance and dignity. The children listened with wide eyes, sometimes glancing toward the barn at the edge of the property, wondering what secrets it held, though they never dared ask. They knew it was forbidden, and the seriousness with which their grandfather guarded it filled them with awe rather than resentment. Meanwhile, the lives of James's children, far from the farm, took a different shape. Daniel, flushed with the money he had secured from the secret sale, poured it into his vision of a technology startup. He leased an office space in the city, hired a handful of programmers, and filled whiteboards with diagrams of systems that promised to revolutionize agriculture. For a brief time, his confidence swelled, and he believed he was proving his father wrong. But the city was not forgiving, and ambition was not enough. Investors pulled out, competitors surged ahead, and expenses mounted faster than income. Within 2 years, the office was empty, the employees gone, and Daniel sat among unpaid bills, the dream collapsing around him. Matthew's restaurant opened with fanfare, a ribbon cut, and tables filled with curious customers. For a while, it seemed he had found his calling. The food was praised, his creativity admired, and he basked in the attention. But the glow faded quickly. Health inspectors cited violations that required costly renovations. Suppliers demanded payments he could not make. The staff grew restless, wages went unpaid, and the restaurant's doors closed sooner than they had opened. What had been a vision of success turned into another debt, another failure. Sarah's boutique, elegant and carefully arranged, stood in a quiet corner of the city. She filled it with dresses and designs that reflected her countryside roots, fabrics stitched with care and imagination. For months, she waited for customers to discover her work, to bring her name into fashion's conversations. But the city was dominated by giants, fast fashion chains with prices she could never compete with, and the boutique emptied of customers. Rent piled up, debts pressed in, and one day she turned the key in the door for the last time, her dream folding under the weight of reality. Each child, in their own way, had taken the money they believed would free them and had found only loss. Instead of triumph, there was humiliation. Instead of proof that they had been right, there was bitter regret. Yet even then, they could not bring themselves to face the truth. It was easier to turn their disappointment outward, to direct their anger at their father, who they claimed had sabotaged them by refusing to help more fully, by withholding what they believed had been theirs all along. They told themselves that if only he had trusted them, if only he had shared the barn's contents or sold more of the land, they would have succeeded. The bitterness festered, widening the rift that already separated them. Back on the farm, James felt their absence like a dull ache, but he did not dwell on it aloud. He poured himself into the rhythm of the land, though his steps were slower, his body reminding him with each season that time was moving against him. Still, he found solace in his grandchildren. When they arrived, the farm came alive again. Lily learned to guide the cows from pasture to barn with calm authority. Emma discovered joy in collecting eggs each morning, her basket clutched tightly in small hands. David followed James everywhere, fascinated by the machines, eager to learn how engines hummed and how tools fit together. James gave them each responsibility, small at first, but growing as they proved themselves. It was in those moments, as he watched his grandchildren take to the land with such eagerness, that James allowed himself to hope. He knew the pain of betrayal would never fully leave him, But perhaps the future was not as dark as it seemed. Perhaps the legacy would survive, even if it skipped a generation. The barn, always closed, remained untouched, its secrets held tight. Not even the laughter of his grandchildren could soften his resolve to keep it locked. It was not yet time. They had to learn patience, respect, and the value of hard work before they could understand what lay hidden behind those weathered doors. The seasons passed, and while his children stumbled through the wreckage of failed ventures, James found strength in the simpler triumphs of harvest and the quiet joy of teaching the next generation. The farm continued to breathe with him, its furrows filled with grain, its orchards heavy with fruit, its animals nurtured with care. But beneath it all, the rift remained, deep and unhealed. James bore it in silence, the lines on his face deepening, his gaze lingering longer on the barn whenever he passed. He knew that time was pressing in, and that one day soon the secrets he had kept so carefully guarded would have to be revealed, not to his children who had turned away, but to those who still listened, who still loved the land enough to learn its language. The story of the Harper family was not yet finished. Betrayal had carved its scars, defeat had humbled the proud, and silence had preserved what words could not mend. Life on the farm went on, steady and patient, waiting for the day when the truth locked inside the barn would rise into the open air and demand to be faced. Until then, James Harper continued his work, guided by the land, comforted by the presence of his grandchildren, and resolved to guard his legacy for as long as breath remained in his body. The farm had grown quieter with every passing year, not because the land itself had ceased its eternal rhythm, but because James Harper, once strong and tireless, could no longer move through it with the same vigor. His steps slowed, his back bent further under the weight of years, and his hands, though still steady, shook when the air was cold in the mornings. Yet he refused to surrender to idleness. At dawn he still rose, his body urging him to stay in bed, but his will carrying him outside, to walk the fields, to greet the animals, to check the fences. The earth had never abandoned him, and he would not abandon it while breath remained in his chest. His children's absence was now an established fact of life, as ordinary as the sunrise. They seldom called, their visits rare and strained when they did occur. When they came to the farmhouse, it was with stiff shoulders and voices that spoke more to courtesy than to love. Their eyes no longer lingered on the rows of crops or the orchards heavy with fruit. They drifted toward the horizon, as if always searching for something beyond their father's reach. James, though wounded, had long since learned to accept it. The betrayal had scarred him deeply, but he carried it in silence, choosing instead to pour what remained of his heart into the grandchildren who still saw him not as an obstacle, but as a guide. The summers continued to be the bright spots in his life. Lily, Emma, and David returned faithfully, bringing with them the laughter that echoed across the fields like a song carried on the wind. They had grown taller, their faces older now, but their affection for the farm remained undiminished. They no longer ran aimlessly through the grass as they had when younger. Instead, they took real responsibility, helping their grandfather in ways that made him proud. Lily learned to take command of the livestock with a calmness beyond her years. Emma kept meticulous records of the hens and their eggs, her notebooks filled with details that showed a budding sense of management. David, always fascinated with machines, grew adept at repairing the smaller engines, his hands dark with grease as he worked beside his grandfather. James felt comfort in these things, but he also knew the truth. Time was pressing upon him. His breath came shorter, His bones ached with a persistence that no rest could soothe, and some mornings he found himself staring at the rising sun with the quiet awareness that he might not see many more. Age was no enemy to him. He had lived long enough to know its inevitability. But it was a messenger, reminding him that if he did not put his affairs in order, all he had protected could be squandered or torn apart after his death. He had watched his father leave this world with nothing but calloused hands to show for his labor, his mother with prayers unanswered. He had vowed long ago that when his time came, he would leave not only land, but clarity. It was during one such quiet morning, the mist still clinging to the fields, that James sat at the old wooden desk in his study and pulled out pen and paper. He began to write with slow, deliberate strokes, his hand unsteady but his mind sharp. He wrote not only a will, but a letter, a message to those who would remain after him. The farm, he decided, would not go to his children. Their betrayal had cut too deeply. Their impatience had proven that they were not ready to guard what he had built. The land had been meant as a safeguard, not as a purse to be emptied. If he left it to them, it would be sold piece by piece, wasted until nothing remained. Instead, he named his grandchildren as heirs, not out of cruelty, but out of hope. They had shown respect, they had shown patience, they had listened. Perhaps they could succeed where their parents had failed. Yet, even as he wrote those words, he knew he could not simply hand them everything. The lessons of the farm were learned through work, not inheritance. So he placed a condition upon his gift. Before they could do anything with the land, before they could think of selling it or altering its fate, they must first clear out the old barn and harvest the final season's crops. Only then would the inheritance be theirs. It was not a punishment, but a final test, a way to ensure that they put their hands to the work, to touch the soil, to feel the labor before they touched the wealth it concealed. The barn had been the source of division, the point of mystery and resentment, but it was also the key to his legacy. In its depths lay not only material proof of his sacrifices, but the lesson that true wealth was not immediate, but cultivated with patience and care. James sealed the will and the letter carefully, placing them in the drawer where his lawyer would know to find them when the time came. Then he sat back, exhausted but at peace. For the first time in many years, he felt a sense of completion. The decisions were made, the path laid out. Whether his family accepted the lessons was no longer his burden. He had sown the seeds. It would be for them to harvest or to waste. The seasons continued, each one harder for James to endure. He no longer worked from dawn to dusk. His grandchildren carried much of the labor, guided by his voice rather than his hands. The children who had once betrayed him sent occasional letters or phone calls, their words polite but hollow. Sometimes they spoke of struggles, of debts, of disappointments, but never with humility, never with the admission that they had been wrong. James listened in silence, offering little beyond quiet encouragement, though his heart ached for what might have been. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned and the air carried the crispness of approaching winter, James walked slowly across the yard toward the barn. He rested his hand on the locked door, the wood cool beneath his fingers. He thought of the years spent guarding its secrets, of the anger it had stirred in his children, of the questions it had raised in the eyes of his grandchildren. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that, when the time came, they would understand, that they would see not just the wealth hidden inside, but the meaning behind it. Then he turned away, his steps measured, his breath heavy, and returned to the farmhouse where the lights glowed softly in the dark. The winter that followed was the hardest yet. James caught an illness that lingered, weakening him further. He spent more days indoors, sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets. His grandchildren visited when they could, their voices filling the rooms with warmth, but the shadow of farewell lingered. He knew, as surely as he had known the seasons all his life, that his own season was ending. And when the spring returned, he did not rise with the dawn as he always had. The farm awoke without him. The family gathered soon after, brought together by the news they had long dreaded but not prepared to face. The farmhouse, filled with mourners, seemed both alive and unbearably hollow. His children arrived, their expressions stiff, their grief mingled with unresolved bitterness. The grandchildren stood apart, tears in their eyes, their hands clasped together. When the lawyer read the will aloud, the air grew tense. The land, the farm, the inheritance, it was all left to the grandchildren. Daniel, Matthew, and Sarah stiffened, their faces hardening as the words sank in. They had been bypassed, left with nothing but the memory of their father's stern love and their own choices. The lawyer continued, explaining the condition. The farm could not be sold until the barn had been cleared and the final harvest gathered. The grandchildren must do this themselves with their own hands, as their grandfather had wished. Murmurs spread through the room. The children bristled, the old resentment sparking anew, but the grandchildren accepted the responsibility with solemn nods. They felt the weight of the trust placed upon them, a weight far heavier than any inheritance of gold could have carried. That evening, after the mourners departed and the farmhouse grew quiet again, the grandchildren sat together on the porch, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. The barn loomed in the distance, silent and forbidding, its locked doors glinting faintly in the last rays of sun. They spoke softly, their voices carrying both fear and anticipation. They would honor their grandfather's wish. They would enter the forbidden place at last, not with resentment, but with reverence. What they would find inside they could not yet imagine, but they knew it would be the final word of a man who had lived by the soil, who had guarded his secrets not out of cruelty, but out of love. The farm slept that night under the stars, its future balanced on the threshold of discovery. The will had been written, the conditions set, and the legacy of James Harper now rested in the hands of those who might finally be ready to understand it. The farmhouse felt different after the reading of the will, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of James Harper's final words. The grandchildren lingered in silence that first evening, each of them struggling with the mixture of grief, pride, and responsibility that had suddenly been placed upon them. The loss of their grandfather was raw, pressing down on their hearts with the fresh pain of absence, but layered upon that grief was the awareness that he had trusted them with something far greater than they had ever imagined. Their parents' bitter expressions at the lawyer's announcement still lingered in memory, faces twisted with disbelief and anger as if they had been denied something rightfully theirs. Yet deep inside, Lily, Emma, and David knew why their grandfather had chosen them. They were the ones who had listened, who had learned, who had walked the fields by his side. Still, the condition he had set was not something they could take lightly. The barn, that locked and looming presence, now called to them with an intensity they had never felt before. The following morning dawned bright, the sun rising with the same indifference it always had, as though the death of the farm's keeper meant nothing to the eternal rhythm of the earth. The grandchildren gathered on the porch, their parents still in town making arrangements for the funeral, and together they made the decision to honor the condition without delay. Their grandfather's words echoed in their minds. Before anything could be sold, before decisions were made, the barn must be cleared and the final harvest taken in. They looked at each other, uncertain, nervous, but resolved. The path to the barn felt longer than it ever had. Each step seemed to carry them deeper into a story that had been written long before they were born. The barn's weathered boards stood like a sentinel against the sky, its roof sagging slightly, its padlock rusted but unbroken. For years it had been a place of speculation, of curiosity they had never dared indulge. Now, the key from their grandfather's will rested in Lily's hand, cool and heavy, the metal worn smooth from decades of use. She hesitated only briefly before sliding it into the lock. With a groan that seemed to echo across the farm, the mechanism turned and the chains fell loose. The doors opened slowly, wood scraping against the packed earth as dust rose into the sunlight. The smell that greeted them was the thick, dry scent of hay, mingled with the sharp tang of oil and old metal. At first, what they saw seemed ordinary enough. Farm equipment covered in tarps, tractors whose paint had faded, plows and harvesters lined neatly against the walls. They stepped inside cautiously, their footsteps stirring up motes of dust that danced in the shafts of light streaming through the cracks in the boards. The barn was quiet, save for the faint creaks of wood and the sound of their own breathing. For 3 days they worked tirelessly, clearing the barn of its clutter, sweeping out decades of hay, oil cans, and rusted tools. They dragged heavy equipment into the light, cataloged what was useful and what was nothing but scrap. Each evening they returned to the house exhausted, their muscles aching, but with the determination that they were not only fulfilling their grandfather's condition, but uncovering a piece of him they had never known. Still, as the barn emptied, a question grew heavier in their minds. Why had he kept this place so fiercely guarded if it contained nothing more than ordinary tools? It was Emma who noticed it first, in the far corner of the barn. The wall there looked different, too smooth, too deliberate. When she tapped it, the sound rang hollow. Excitement and unease coursed through them as they pulled away the remaining bales of hay stacked against it. What they revealed was not just a wall, but a false panel, expertly constructed to blend in with the rest of the structure. Their hearts pounded as they exchanged glances, the weight of discovery pressing on them. With trembling hands, David found the edge of the panel and pried it loose. The wood shifted reluctantly, and behind it lay a hidden space. The room was small, concealed so carefully that no casual visitor could have suspected its existence. Inside, a single heavy briefcase sat on a table, its leather aged but well kept. Beside it was something large draped in a canvas tarp, the outline of a vehicle visible beneath. The grandchildren stepped inside, the air thick and still, as if the space itself had been waiting for them. Lily reached for the briefcase, lifting it onto the table, her hands shaking. With a click, the latches opened and the lid creaked back. Inside, neatly organized in folders and envelopes, were documents that stunned them into silence. Stock certificates, property deeds, investment portfolios, decades of careful accumulation. James Harper, the man who had lived like a humble farmer, had quietly built a fortune. He had taken the modest profits of the land and invested them with patience and wisdom, letting them grow unseen. The numbers on the pages spoke of millions, a wealth far beyond anything they had imagined. Alongside the documents lay a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed but the ink clear. They gathered around as Lily unfolded it, her voice trembling as she read aloud. In the letter, their grandfather explained what they were seeing. He had watched his own father lose everything to reckless spending, had seen how quickly money could vanish when handled without care. He had learned that true wealth was not in sudden windfalls, but in steady growth, in patience, in protecting what mattered. He had never revealed his fortune to his children because he feared it would corrupt them, that they would squander it without understanding its value. Instead, he had chosen to wait, to let the wealth grow as the crops grew, slowly, season by season, until the time was right. He wrote that he had left it to his grandchildren because they had shown respect for the land, because they had listened to his lessons, because he believed they could carry the legacy forward. Tears blurred Emma's eyes as she finished reading. The silence that followed was filled with awe, grief, and the heavy realization of all that their grandfather had carried in silence. Then David stepped forward and pulled the canvas tarp from the large shape that stood beside the table. As the fabric fell away, the sight took their breath. A car gleamed beneath the dust, its curves elegant, its lines unmistakable. It was a pristine 1962 Ferrari, red as fire, every detail preserved. It looked as though it had just rolled out of the factory, though decades had passed since it had been hidden here. Another note lay upon its hood, explaining that James had purchased it as an anniversary gift for their grandmother, intending to surprise her. But her sudden illness had stolen the chance, and after her death he could not bear to part with it. Instead, he preserved it, knowing its value would only grow with time, a silent monument to love and loss. The grandchildren stood in stunned silence, the weight of history pressing upon them. They had entered the barn expecting dust and rust, and instead they had found a treasure greater than any of them could have imagined. Yet it was not the money nor the car that struck them most deeply. It was the realization of why their grandfather had kept it hidden, why he had borne the resentment of his children without explanation. He had not been hoarding wealth for himself. He had been protecting it for them, waiting until they could understand not only its value, but the lesson behind it. When they finally emerged from the barn, the evening sun bathed the fields in gold, and the farm seemed transformed. The weight of the secret had been lifted, and with it came a new sense of purpose. They knew that the revelation would not heal the wounds between their parents and their grandfather, but it might help explain them. The barn, once a symbol of division, had become a testament to patience, love, and foresight. The next day, they shared their discovery with their parents. The reaction was silence at first, followed by disbelief, then a flood of regret. Daniel, Matthew, and Sarah stood pale and shaken as they realized the truth. Their father had not been a miser, withholding resources out of cruelty. He had been a guardian, keeping safe what he knew they were not ready to handle. The impatience that had driven them to betrayal had cost them not only a fortune, but the chance to understand him while he was alive. At James Harper's grave, the family gathered together, the soil still fresh upon the mound. Tears fell freely as the children and grandchildren alike mourned not only the man they had lost, but the years wasted in misunderstanding. The grandchildren felt the weight of his trust more keenly than ever, and the parents bowed under the burden of their regret. The farm, standing steady as always, now held not only the memory of labor and love, but the revealed truth of a legacy carefully built and fiercely protected. The barn was no longer forbidden. It was a sanctuary of lessons waiting for those willing to listen. And the Harper family, broken though it had been, stood together in that moment, knowing that though time could not be reclaimed, the future still held the possibility of redemption. The discovery inside the barn did not end with astonishment alone. It reverberated through the family like a tremor that shook every memory, every resentment, every bitter word that had been spoken. In the days that followed, the grandchildren found themselves returning again and again to that hidden room. They would stand in silence before the documents and the gleaming Ferrari, trying to absorb not only the enormity of their grandfather's wealth, but the depth of his restraint. It was almost impossible to reconcile the man they had known, the quiet farmer who rose with the sun, whose clothes were always streaked with soil and sweat, with the man who had orchestrated this secret life of investments and preservation. Yet, as they read and reread his letter, they began to understand that there had never been two men. James Harper had always been the same, only more complex than anyone had realized. He had chosen silence, believing that the truth revealed too soon could destroy instead of strengthen. Their parents, however, struggled in ways far different. When Daniel, Matthew, and Sarah first heard of the treasure concealed within the barn, their faces betrayed disbelief that soon twisted into regret, and then into a grief sharper than they had known even at the funeral. They had spent so many years convinced that their father had denied them out of cruelty, that his stubbornness had stolen their chance at happiness. Now, confronted with the evidence that he had been protecting them, their anger collapsed beneath the crushing weight of guilt. For Daniel, the memory of his failed startup burned brighter than ever, not because of the loss of money, but because he now understood how blind ambition had cost him not only his dream, but his relationship with his father. Matthew, once so proud of his restaurant, now thought of the way he had spoken to James in harsh tones, dismissing him as a man too old-fashioned to understand the future. And Sarah, who had long resented the barn as a symbol of selfishness, found herself unable to look at its doors without tears, knowing her father had been safeguarding a legacy he wished she would respect. The grandchildren watched their parents with a mix of compassion and sorrow. They could see the pain in their eyes, the heaviness that clung to their shoulders, yet they also felt the difference between themselves and their parents as keenly as the line drawn in the will. They were the ones entrusted, the ones chosen, and though it filled them with humility rather than pride, it was also a responsibility that set them apart. In quiet moments together, they spoke of what must come next. Selling the farm would have been the simplest choice, one that could have freed them into lives of ease in the city. But the idea felt wrong, almost like a betrayal of the man who had guarded the land with his very soul. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with streaks of crimson and violet, the family gathered at the graveside. The mound of earth still looked fresh, the headstone simple and unadorned, just as James would have wanted. The grandchildren stood closest, their hands clasped, while their parents hung back, hesitant, as though afraid to approach. After a long silence, Daniel stepped forward, his voice thick as he spoke aloud to the grave. He confessed his mistakes, his arrogance, the blindness that had led him to turn against the man who had given him everything. His words broke something in the air, and Matthew followed, his voice trembling as he admitted his pride, his foolish certainty that his father did not understand him when in truth he had not taken the time to understand his father. Sarah, weeping openly, knelt beside the grave and whispered apologies for years of bitterness, for the harsh words she could never take back. The grandchildren listened, their hearts aching, as the three finally poured out the remorse that had been buried as deeply as their father now was. In that moment, though no voice rose from the earth to answer them, a sense of release seemed to settle over the family. The grief did not vanish, nor did the years of distance, But something shifted. They were no longer carrying anger alone. They were sharing in sorrow, acknowledging loss, and allowing the possibility of reconciliation, not with the man who had gone, but with the lessons he had left behind. The days that followed were filled with decisions. The grandchildren, after long conversations, resolved that the farm would not be sold. It was not simply land to them, it was the very foundation of their family, the living proof of generations who had dreamed, worked, and sacrificed. They agreed to keep it, to run it as their grandfather had, but with their own hands and minds guiding it into a new era. The documents in the briefcase provided them with wealth enough to secure the farm's future and to create opportunities beyond it, but they would not squander it. Instead, they decided to invest carefully, just as James had done, allowing the fortune to grow quietly as the crops grew in the fields. They also spoke of how to honor his memory in ways beyond maintaining the farm. Lily suggested opening part of the property as an educational center for local children, where they could learn about agriculture, about history, about the dignity of labor that too many had forgotten. Emma proposed restoring the barn, not just as a storage place, but as a monument, where the story of their grandfather and the hidden legacy could be told. David, his hands always drawn to machines, wanted to build a workshop where young people could learn the skills of repair and invention, linking the past to the future. Their parents, humbled, listened, their earlier objections fading as they recognized the wisdom in their children's vision. Slowly, they began to support the idea, offering what help they could, perhaps as a way of atoning for the years they had turned away. On the farm itself, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The grandchildren, though still adjusting, found themselves rising earlier, walking the rows of crops and tending to the animals much as James had once done. The work was hard, the sun unrelenting, and their muscles ached, but in those long hours they felt closer to their grandfather than ever. They began to understand in their bones what he had always meant, that the land was not only food and security, but a teacher, shaping patience, endurance, and humility. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, sharing stories of James, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, but always feeling his presence as if he lingered in the fields, watching over them. The barn, once a place of secrecy and resentment, became something else entirely. Its doors were kept open now, sunlight streaming into the space that had once been shadowed. Visitors came to see the Ferrari, to marvel at the hidden room, to hear the story of the farmer who had lived simply while guarding a fortune in silence. But the grandchildren knew that the car and the documents were not the true treasure. The true treasure was the lesson of patience, of trust, of protecting what mattered until the time was right. Years later, when people spoke of James Harper, they did not speak only of the fortune he had left behind or the car gleaming in the barn. They spoke of a man who had lived faithfully to the soil, who had endured betrayal and yet chosen love, who had guarded his legacy not for himself, but for the future. His family, once broken, stood together again, not perfectly healed, but bound by the understanding he had worked so hard to instill. The Harper farm remained in the family, its fields stretching across the horizon as they always had. The grandchildren became its stewards, and their parents, though marked by regret, found redemption in helping to preserve what their father had cherished. At the center of it all, the barn stood no longer as a forbidden place, but as a monument to patience and perseverance. And though James Harper no longer walked the rows at dawn, his spirit lingered in every furrow of soil, in every sunrise over the fields, A reminder that true wealth is not measured in money alone, but in the strength to protect what matters most. If you were hooked by this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Click on the screen to watch the next shocking video or dive into one of our most jaw-dropping stories that people can't stop talking about. And don't keep this secret to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can be just as stunned as you were.